Well, what you just heard enunciated, which was this will delay the inevitable and in the process cost the taxpayers a whole bunch of money. I think that everybody would like to see those big three make it in the United States of America for a lot of different reasons, jobs and domestic capacity in terms of manufacturing among them. But the key is, how do you get there? And if you look at Chapter 11 route versus yet another government bailout, it seems overwhelming that the Chapter 11 route will get us quicker to a more competitive domestic auto industry in the United States of America.
I read in the Wall Street Journal that you wrote that you think that bailouts are basically they're bailing out people who don't deserve it, which is kind of what got us in trouble in the first place. The mortgage companies started lending money to people who could not afford to pay it back. They didn't have enough cash flow to pay back those loans, and look where we are. Is the federal government any different? I mean, there are people who say, look, there are millions of jobs on the lines, and if these car companies go bankrupt, people will stop buying American cars, and you're going to send this country into a tailspin, into a depression.
Well, I'd say two different things there. One is, if you look at the history of Chapter 11, people actually got on United Airlines flights, I mean, quote, risking their lives in the process, and continued to fly, though they were in Chapter 11. If you look more recently, over just the last couple of weeks, Circuit City.
But that's a $300 investment for a flight as opposed to a $30,000 investment for a new car.
Well, I would take humble exception with that. If you take an international flight on United, and a lot of the routes are indeed at United, you're talking about a whole lot more than $300. You're probably talking a lot more than $3,000 if you're talking about a business class ticket. So I would take humble exception with the notion of pricing on that one. And I don't think that there's anything more precious than one's life. I mean, you really care about the quality of an airline when you get in and are, quote, put into harm's way in the process. So I think it is a significant decision for a lot of people. I will grant you the fact that the financial decision with regard to a car is a bigger decision. But the question is, if they went Chapter 11, would that preclude folks from buying a car in that case? And I don't think it would, and I don't think the history of Chapter 11 across a broad range of different projects suggests that.
So when legislators are looking at how to get the country out of the economic bind that we're currently in, and a lot of experts agree that taking action and decisive action, early action, is most important. What are you doing in the state of South Carolina that you think that the senators and the congressmen on the Hill could follow your example in terms of your state of South Carolina?
Well, for instance, yesterday in Greer, South Carolina, we announced the tax component of our budget, which we'll release in January. And we had two things in there: a phase down of the income tax rate in South Carolina for an optional flat tax of 3.65%. And we actually had a proposal that would take our corporate rate from 5% down to 0%. My point here is that when you think about this notion of economic stimulus, you got to think a lot broader than simply borrowing money, writing checks out of Washington, D.C. to solve a problem that was created by too much borrowing. And I think you got to look at competitive issues, whether with regard to tax or regard to a whole range of different things. That you want to interrupt me, though? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm sorry, but we're just running short on time here, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about your take on this whole scandal that has erupted. Rod Blagojevich, one of your colleagues, in terms of being a governor of a state here who's now been charged, and we're just coming out with the news that candidate number 5, Jesse Jackson Jr., the congressman from Illinois. What's your overall reaction to all of this, Governor?
I'm in the same level of horror that anybody who picks up and reads the paper today or watched news last night comes with, which is what was done was wrong. The whole notion of public trust is a big deal, and if you go about this notion of actually contemplating the idea of selling a United States Senate seat, you ought to be gone, period, end of story. And again, I think he dug his own grave with the things that he said about contemplating that very act. So I think there's no question about it, he ought to be gone, but that's for the people, I guess, up that way to decide. What is important that the voters out there decide on and make their voice heard on is this bailout thing. The reason I'm on your show is to beg of people to make their voice heard, because we're at a tipping point on, I think, what comes next in the American civilization, if you want to call it that.
Governor Sanford, I do appreciate so much you adding your perspective to all of this. Thanks.
Yes, ma'am. Take care.